Hello everyone and welcome to today's EAUC webinar. The title of this webinar is Adaptation Part 1, Definitions, the Process and Getting Started, and it will last approximately 1 hour. Thank you for registering, and thanks also to Sophie Turner from Adaptation Scotland and to David Stutchfield from the University of St Andrews, who will be speaking today. My name is Rebecca Petford and I am the Scotland Programme Coordinator here at the EAUC. If you have any specific event, webinar or training requests, please do get in touch at any time. Just a little bit of housekeeping to go over now. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me well. I've muted you all to avoid background noise, and you'll continue to be muted throughout the webinar. If you're having any technical issues at all throughout this webinar, please let me know by either posting in the on-screen chat box, which is bottom right on your screen, or sending me an email to rpetford@eauc.org.uk. We will take questions using the chat box. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the chat box and send them to EAUC using the drop-down menu. I will read them out to Sophie and David at the appropriate time, so please be as clear as you can in your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded as a resource with the presentation tomorrow. Please feel free to share these resources with any colleagues or fellow EAUC members. Once the webinar is finished, you'll be sent a short survey for us to gain your feedback. Please take a few minutes to complete this survey, as the results will help us to improve our CPD and events. That's all for me for now. Thanks again for registering, and I will now pass you over to Sophie Turner.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon, My name is Sophie Turner, I'm the Climate Resilience Project Coordinator at Adaptation Scotland, and the EAUC has invited us to provide a webinar on adaptation for those of you who are unable to make our adaptation training event in Edinburgh in May. For any of you that did attend that training, this will be more of a refresher for you, and because that was a full-day event, we've split the webinars into 2 sessions. So this one today is an introduction to adaptation, and the second one next week, same time, same place, on Wednesday the 20th of July, we'll cover the adaptation section of the public body's climate change reporting, and we'll also hear from Roddy Yar from the University of Strathclyde. So for today's presentation, I'll start by explaining who Adaptation Scotland are and what we do. I'll give you some background information about how the climate is changing and what this means for universities and colleges. I'll then explain what adaptation is and how this differs from mitigation, and I'll give an introduction to the adaptation process before handing over to David Stutchfield from the University of St Andrews, who will explain what work he's done on adaptation and how he got started. So a little bit about who we are. Adaptation Scotland is a programme funded by the Scottish Government and delivered by an environmental charity called SNIFR. Our role is to increase the resilience of organisations, businesses and communities to the impacts of climate change, and we do this by providing guidance and support on adaptation. So this support takes many forms. We develop tools and resources such as our 5-step guidance, which I'll talk about later. We help raise awareness about adaptation through presentations and providing information on our website. And we encourage and support organisations, either within the same sector or across different sectors, to work together on adaptation projects. And we deliver training events and courses on adaptation for different groups and sectors, such as this event today. So when we talk about climate change, some people think of something that's going to happen in 50 or 100 years' time, but Scotland's climate is already changing, and we have long records of observed climate data to show how it has changed. So since 1961, the number of heavy rainfall days, that's intense rainfall days, has increased by 8 days, and average rainfall has also increased, with the biggest changes occurring over winter, with annual winter rainfall increasing by 27% across Scotland since 1961. Sea levels have been rising at all of Scotland's ports over the last century, with the rate of sea level rise now at 3 to 4 millimetres a year. Average temperatures have increased by between 1 and 1.6 degrees in the last 40 years, which has led to the growing season being nearly 5 weeks longer. And there's been an increase in the number of severe weather events such as storms and high wind speeds. There's also been a reduction in the number of frost and snow days across the country. And all of these changes are projected to continue and intensify over the coming decades. So what does this mean for Scotland? Well, with increased rainfall and more heavy downpours, flood risk is likely to increase in the future, and this could impact on properties and infrastructure and affect our homes, our places of work and our heritage. With the rate of sea level rise set to accelerate over the coming decades, we can expect more coastal flooding, erosion and coastline retreat, which will impact on our coastal communities and their infrastructure. But a changing climate will also bring opportunities, with warmer conditions providing more chances to be outdoors and enjoy a healthy and active lifestyle. So we also need to think about the design and construction of our buildings, whether retrofitting existing ones with larger gutters, for example, or to building new developments such as student accommodation. So we're likely to see issues with overheating, high wind speeds and flooding, and so for new builds, this means considering these impacts at the design and planning application stage of their development. Our electricity, transport and IT networks are also likely to be impacted by an increase in severe weather events, such as flooding, landslides, storms and heat waves. And as our infrastructure is so closely interlinked, failure in any one area could lead to a wider disruption across these networks. And something also to consider is, as our climate changes, new conditions may allow pests and diseases to spread and new threats to become established. So this may impact our health, our animals, our plants and ecosystems if it's not properly managed. So what does this mean for universities and colleges? Well, climate change will indirectly impact on telecommunication systems, energy and water systems and transport systems, which could affect staff's ability to get into work or work from home. So it might be useful to look into whether any of your IT infrastructure or services are outsourced and how vulnerable they are to climate impacts. In terms of assets, university and college estates can include large areas of green space, playing fields, golf courses, old and new buildings, forests, farms and rivers, and all of these could be affected by climate change in one way or another. So whether through waterlogging, flooding, low water levels, or damage to the fabric or the buildings or new pests and diseases. However, because there is a lot of land involved, these assets come with huge potential to cope with climate change. So there's potential to use some of the green spaces as flood storage. And in Edinburgh, the university have had conversations with the council and SEPA to allow some of their playing fields to flood during periods of heavy rain. And this is now implemented as part of a wider catchment management plan to reduce the flooding of properties in the area. Some campuses operate like small cities with their buildings and agriculture and power generation, and although this makes them vulnerable to climate impacts, there's also the opportunity to use existing green spaces or add new green or blue spaces that can provide cooler environments during warmer summer weather. So as an educational institution, your focus will be on teaching and research, campus operations and community engagement. And what's important for all of this is business continuity. So it's important for staff and students to be able to continue with their work and studies and buildings to function as they're supposed to. So you might have heard how earlier in the year, 17 schools in Edinburgh closed over safety fears when a wall collapsed during a storm. Although this isn't directly linked to climate change, it's a useful example to think about with the vulnerability of different buildings based on their usage and how different building fabrics could respond to an increase in severe weather events in the future. It's also worth thinking about how climate impacts that occur at the global scale will have consequences at the local level. In 2011, there was heavy rainfall in Thailand, which caused flooding in factories that produced hard drives for computers, and this in turn caused shortage in hard drives and long delays to companies trying to order new computers. And the final point is about people. Staff and students are at the heart of any university, so it's important to consider the impacts on their health and well-being. So 2 years ago, 250 students from Aberystwyth University were evacuated from their seafront student accommodation when storms hit the Welsh coast. So students were told to prepare an overnight bag and leave within minutes. And the storm hit on a day that exams were due to start, but these had to be pushed back a week to give people a time to return to business as usual. So it's important to think about the impact that such an event could have on students, whether they are from the UK or international students, and many of them will be living away from home for the first time, and some may experience severe weather events or other crises in their home country. So I've covered a lot about the impacts or the potential impacts of a changing climate. So we now need to find ways to reduce those negative impacts and enhance the positive ones. And most of the ways of doing this fall into one of two categories. There's mitigation or adaptation. And it's easy to confuse the two, but they are very different responses. So I'm going to just talk about that now. So mitigation is about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So we do this by using our car less, flying less, buying local food or refurbishing the boilers to make them more efficient, and reducing our energy consumption. Not to be confused with adaptation, which is about adjusting to the impacts of climate change to reduce the negative impacts and exploit any opportunities. So this might include having an on-site power generator in case of disruption to the network, tiling flooring or removing carpets from accommodation that are at risk of flooding, relocating vulnerable buildings, whether because of their usage or because they're at risk from coastal erosion, or building seawalls to protect infrastructure. This is another definition of adaptation, the more technical version taken from the Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. So this states that adaptation is the adjustment in economic, social or natural systems in response to actual or expected climatic change, to limit the harmful consequences and exploit any beneficial opportunities. So what this is saying is if your organisation plans and prepares for the changes in the climate now, you'll be able to build your resilience to the potential negative consequences and be better placed to take advantage of any opportunities that the impacts could create. So with adaptation, the earlier you start to address the impacts and integrate adaptation into your plans and decisions, the more effective and less costly they'll be compared to paying for the costs reactively or following an event. As well as the changing climate conditions, there have been new acts introduced, creating new policies and legislative changes. So the Climate Change Scotland Act from 2009 requires a Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme, or SCAP, which addresses the risks identified in the UK's climate change risk assessment. The Act also established the public body's climate change duties, which, as you know, requires public bodies to help deliver this programme. And part of this delivery involves reporting on adaptation work through the public body's climate change reporting. So this was introduced on a voluntary basis last year and became mandatory to report on an annual basis from this year. So all of these reports are in the public domain, with last year's reports available from the SSM website, and I believe the deadline for this year's reports is the 30th of November. So managing your risks to climate change is part of the adaptation process, which you can see here. An adaptation process commonly consists of 5 steps, like this one, which has been developed to break down the process into more manageable tasks. This process is taken from our guidance document, which is called 5 Steps to Managing Your Climate Risks, which you can download from our website. And this document might also be useful for you to refer to when you're completing your public body's climate change reports. So, working clockwise from the top, step 1 is about identifying who you will work with on adaptation and gaining buy-in from your senior managers to work on adaptation, and checking your risk register to include climate risks. Step 2 involves identifying what climate impacts your university or college are vulnerable to. Step 3 is about looking at the risks you are vulnerable to and identifying and prioritising the most significant climate risks to adapt to. Step 4 is where you implement your adaptation actions and develop an action plan for your adaptation actions. And step 5 involves monitoring and reviewing your climate risks that you're vulnerable to, and then reviewing your policy documents to see if adaptation can be included, and evaluating your adaptation work and process. So step 1 is about getting started. This includes identifying what you want to achieve, whether you want to protect your university's or college's physical infrastructure to be more resilient to climate change, whether you want to be seen as leaders on climate change adaptation, or if you want to show you're making progress with adaptation through the public body's reporting process. You might want to identify who will be responsible for any adaptation work and where that person sits within your organisation. Is it with a sustainability officer, the estates manager, and will there be one person within each department who has a role to play? It could be useful to identify who's available to support you, both internally and externally. So speak to your local council to find out who's working on adaptation and what they've done. They may be able to help you with your adaptation work or share data or reports that are available with you. Embedding adaptation-related risk on your risk register might be tricky for some of you, but it could be an easy win, and that can help to raise the profile of climate change and adaptation within your organisation. So have a look at what's currently on your risk register and see if you can add or revise the text to include climate change. The final point is about building the business case. So a business case might be useful to help you to explain to your management team why they should support your time on adaptation, and it might be in the form of a briefing paper which sets out what you are trying to achieve or why working on adaptation is important to the organisation and how much time you'll need to allocate to it. So the outputs from completing this step might include having adaptation included on the risk register or developing a business case. So step 2 of the guidance is about understanding your organisation's vulnerability to climate change. The first part of this step is about becoming familiar with the past and future climate trends. So you don't need to be an expert, it's just having a look at what the text says and having a look through your 5-step guidance. If you do have that to hand, it's on page 42 of the guidance, but that's also available on our website. It's also an opportunity to engage with the heads of service, senior managers or other departments such as facilities, estates or student accommodation services. And it's just a really useful part of the process because it gives you the opportunity to have a conversation with other departments and understand your university or college and its critical infrastructure, its critical functions, how they've been affected by weather events in the past and how they might be affected by future climate impacts. So you can then start to discuss what's in place to manage those risks and if there's anything more that you can do in the future. What you should then have is a list of your universities or colleges' services, assets and critical infrastructure that are most vulnerable to climate change, which is useful to go forward when you want to complete a climate change risk assessment. So I've given you a little bit of detail about what's involved in steps 1 and 2 of our adaptation process. Step 3 is about undertaking a climate change risk assessment, and once you get to this step, you can either refer to our guidance document or contact ourselves or EAUC so we can support you with this next step. I'm now going to hand over to David Stutchfield from the University of St Andrews to explain some of the work he has completed as part of this process, and this should give you some idea of how you can get started with your adaptation work.
Hi, I'm David Stutchfield. I'm the Energy Officer at the University of St Andrews. I work in estates and I'm responsible for carbon reduction and carbon reporting across the whole of the university. I don't know whether we want to take any questions about what Sophie has just presented to us before we get on to how we have implemented that in practice. So, Becca, do you want to talk about that?
If anybody's got any questions, please do put them in the chat box and we will read them out.
While you're typing those questions for Sophie, I'll just give a brief overview of the university and what we have done for climate change adaptation. For sustainability, we have a Sustainable Development Working Group, which is chaired by our Chief Operating Officer and has academics and practitioners just looking at sustainability issues across the university. So one of our key drivers was the mandatory climate change reporting. That's the hook that we have used to talk to that group and say, this is the reporting that we're going to need to do, that the Scottish Government requires us to say, what are you doing about climate change adaptation? We can quite happily write, well, we're not doing anything, or we can write that we're part of this process and describe where we were. That was an extremely powerful tool for senior management to be able to say, right, go ahead and actually start running some of this and start looking at this process, because it's quite clear that it's better to have something to report rather than nothing to report. So what have we done? We have looked at flood risk assessments of our key assets, and we've got three main campuses. So we have that might be affected by climate change. We have the North Hall area, we have Garbridge, which is a paper mill that we bought in 2010, and then we have the Sands area. So we've worked through the climate change assessment tool, CCAT. That's produced by Adaptation Scotland, and for me was the key to getting started on the whole process, and I'll talk a bit more about that. We looked at the university global risk register, and we've added climate risk, and we've ran some climate threat and opportunity assessment workshops with the estates group and then with the residential business services group, and starting to develop initial adaptation plans. And actually just running those workshops has been very interesting from the university point of view. So to look at our estate, this is a map of the whole university with buildings in red showing that those are the buildings that we own within the town of St Andrews. So for the town itself, that's at a high level. The medieval people knew how to build a town without flood risks. We've expanded into a lower area, and we have flood risks as part of our building development program. This is not done for adaptation or anything. It's just part of what we've been doing for doing new buildings there. So this is typically the northern part of what you see is near the Swilcan Burn, and that is a potential flood risk. But we then have all of the buildings that you see in the satellite image. They have runoff. We need to mitigate the runoff from those buildings. We need to design those buildings to withstand the extra heat. But in terms of the flood, the runoff is something that we need to be looking at. So our Garbridge site is about 4 miles away from us. The Seawall is part of the Five Coastal Protection Scheme program, and our researchers themselves are interested in the estuary and the climate science for that. So this is a image of our the paper mill that we bought. Most of the buildings inside have been knocked down already. The big shed at the south end is where we will be putting a biomass plant to provide biomass heating for the rest of the university. That is a mitigation effect, but what we're now looking, and this is the adaptation, to say, actually this is an estuary, we need to maintain the seawall, we need to perhaps increase the seawall at that point to prevent flooding. And we do have flood risk as part of assessments as part of that development program. Then on the east of the town, we have another group of buildings, which are halls of residence and academic buildings and the estates building, looking out over the sea. that's great, but we need to do, obviously the buildings have done flood risk assessment, and the image there is showing that was done for the development of the Gatti Marine Labs, which is the bit in the dry, and the consultants were very pleased to prove that their buildings wouldn't be in any flood risk whatsoever. However, the development of the accommodation behind is something that we are going to need to look at. Doesn't mean to say we're not to develop it, it just needs to know that we need to be aware of that during the development process and make sure that we're not making things worse, and we have a reaction when we're planning that, in which we'll be planning in the next few years, that we may be aware that it's possible that that may flood. So I talked about the climate change and assessment tool. This is from Resource Efficient Scotland. It's a spreadsheet that you fill in and run workshops looking at the different scores. So it's dealing with governance. How do we manage climate change within the university? Emissions, what is the carbon emissions from all of our different activities? How well are we managing that? Adaptation, what are we doing about adaptation to climate change? Behavior change of staff, and then what are we doing in terms of procurement and how are we managing sustainable procurement? I filled in this spreadsheet myself, so I did an assessment, a slightly pessimistic assessment of where I thought we were in all of these different locations, and then went to the Sustainable Development Working Group and had 2 sessions where we looked at governance and we looked at adaptation, and went through my answers and said, are these right? Am I being pessimistic or am I being optimistic? We did change for adaptation. We did change that process, and we're now at a much higher score for adaptation through that. So as you work through that tool, through that adaptation, it asks a whole series of questions about where you are within that process, and we answered, and you fill in comments about where you think you are. The output of that is then to rank the actions that you could take and give you a list of, well, what should you be doing? So in terms of the results, these were the results for the adaptation. So the key one there was, have you defined the challenges? So that we needed to put the climate change on the risk register, and we haven't monitored any effects yet. Have you assessed the climate change threats and opportunities? Well, we've not organised any workshop, but we've got a perception of that. Have you assessed the climate change risks and the different actions? So no, and so on. We went through each of those different points. The key one that came out of that was the easy thing to do, which was to look at the risk register. So the output of the Sustainable Development Working Group was, we need to put climate risks onto our university risk register. That gave me the opening to go into our risk manager and say, I've been asked by the Chief Operating Officer to put climate change risks onto the risk register, and that's a very, very much easier sell to get in there. So they opened the risk register. I looked at all of the individual risks and identified, of the existing risks that were there, what would be an effect of climate change. So insurance costs, we're on there already, so increased insurance costs. Power outages, we may get more frequent power outages. Major travel delays, getting to and from the university and around the world. Well, our staff, A, commute in, but B, travel all over the world. We travel about 50 million miles by plane. So there may be an effect on climate change on that. Harm to students and staff away from St Andrews. Well, we run student workshops and student courses all over the world, and our staff are traveling all over the world. So it may not just be climate change here that affects us, it could be climate change events somewhere else. Widespread staff absences. If the Tay Ridge Road Bridge is closed and all the roads are flooded, then we won't be able to get into to work. And there have been some instances of that in the past. And if key staff can't get in, then the students who are living here may have a more difficult time. And then physical damage to buildings from flooding. So that was on the register anyway. What I've done with all of these is now converted them to a climate risk. So for the last one, we've actually got a climate risk against that. For all of the other ones, I've been added as a risk manager for each of those items. So what this means is that if you are, for instance, planning a new building or looking at that, you have to identify from the risk register, actually, we need to be doing something about this. And it's a very much more powerful way of getting the adaptation risks identified and put into the process. So what was the next thing we've done? Well, we've recently run some climate threat and opportunity workshops. That's earlier on this month. So that was 2 workshops looking with estate staff, starting with the Director of Estates downwards, and with residential business services who are managing our student accommodation and all of our catering within the university. So our objectives of that were to raise awareness of adaptation within the senior management, identify where the climate change will affect the operation of the units, identify what data should be gathered to create a department adaptation report and plan, and understand what resources are going to be needed. So I had built into our Scottish Funding Council annual report, annual agreement, there was a section on sustainability, and I had written into that Scottish Funding Council document that actually we would be running these workshops as well. So that was another thing that we're doing it, because it's the right thing to do, but from a university point of view, we're doing it because we've said to the Scottish Funding Council we're going to do it, and we're doing it because we want to report on it when we finished it. So the outcome of those workshops were actually really, really interesting. With our new builds, we have BREEAM Excellent as our minimum standard for all of our new builds. As part of that process, our consultants need to produce a low and zero carbon technology report. We have, the Director of Estates has then said, well, why don't we ask them to produce an adaptation report as well, so that we can, that's a very simple thing to add at this early stage, but we get the consultants to then say, okay, these are the things we thought about for adaptation with this new building, and this is how we've, this is why we've made the design decisions we have. So that is absolutely perfect in terms of requires no more work by us. It will just happen now. For any new buildings, that will just happen. And what we're trying to do is to build in all of these things into the way that people are thinking. So for the residential business services, they're more student-facing. They were very, very interested in this concept of how we put resilience to the issues of travel, getting in and out, and not having staff absences, because that is a crucial thing for them. So they're going away and thinking about that whole process. It's been quite interesting that just running those workshops has enlightened them. This is not the major issue that's confronting estates and residential business services. It's a very, very small part. But it's the type of thing that once you've raised the awareness and it's in the back of everyone's mind, then they will naturally the light bulb will come on and would naturally change their actions. And so it's not something you have to keep pushing. I think it's something that will just be the type of thing that we do as a university. So in terms of our next steps and where we are, we need to collect the information from the 2 workshops to write those up and start to develop our adaptation plans for the estates and residential business services. Obviously, we now are a little bit further forward. We've got more stuff to talk about for the November reporting process. And we are beginning to get an idea of the local climate impact profile, as in how is the university being affected by climate change? How many times is the Tay Road Bridge shut because of high winds and the Forth Road Bridge shut because of high winds, and people can't get in because of flooding? And how often are our drains getting overloaded and blocked because of high rainfall events? So obviously, we need to maintain things more often and have a better regime of cleaning out our gutters and our downpipes and our drains and so on. But we're beginning to put together a profile of actually what has affected us in the past. Why have we had issues? So we can find out from the Tay Bridge how often they've been shut. We can find out from Fife Council what their LCLIP is. I've tried contacting Fife Council, but we actually haven't had any response back yet. But as this is early days for the process, then it's not a big issue there. So it's been an interesting process. It's just trying to find where is the nudge point that you can work at to not bang your head against the wall on this type of thing. Where is it going to be easiest just to make a short change? I found that people are very interested in this once you explain what it's about, and it's not too much of an ask. So simple things like we're not really using the CCAT tool properly in terms of I've been filling it in and then we've been discussing it. That's a simpler way of doing it than having a full day workshop looking at the CCAT tool, because no one's got the time to do that. So it's just been a quick hour doing that. And so I'm trying to find ways to minimize the disruption but maximize the effect within the university. I think that's really all I've got to say now. So I think that's I'm very happy to take any questions on that, and we'll follow on for the rest of the seminar.
Thank you, David. I hope that's inspired you all with ideas to get started on adaptation. If it seems like David has achieved a lot, he has, but he also only started looking into adaptation last summer. So you too can achieve what St Andrews has achieved over the last 12 months. So as a recap of some of the tasks that you can do to get started, you can start to have conversations about adaptation with your colleagues and managers, and tell them what you've learned through this webinar, or why you think adaptation is important. You can find out about your risk register and whether climate risks is included or can be added. You can work through the climate change assessment tool that David spoke about, either by yourself or with your colleagues, and that's available from the Resource Efficient Scotland website. And you can familiarise yourself with the past climate change information and the future climate trends information to increase your confidence to have conversations with other people. So that's it from us today, but I hope we can take some questions and help you with anything adaptation related.
So if anybody's got any questions, please type them in the chat box, which is bottom right-hand side of your screen. We'll just wait a few minutes for the questions to come in. No questions have arrived yet, so I'll start on finishing off, and if any appear, we will pause. So I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to Sophie and David for your input today, and thank you to you all for tuning in. Oh, we do have a question, brilliant. We would like to know if it's possible to see or use the workshops that David has used. So I will unmute David, and he can answer that question.
Yes, the workshop was facilitated by Sniffer, by Sophie, and certainly the slides will be available. When we have done the write-up, I'm quite happy to share that write-up across the network so that people can see the type of things that that had come out of that workshop. Or the workshops. So it was a workshop based on the climate impact assessment on page 19 of the 5 Steps book, just looking at what we're doing at the moment and what we can do in future. But I'm very happy to share that later.
Great, thank you. We've had one other question come through as well. And it says, knowing that if climate change happens full swing, we can't really adapt to it properly since the environment would not really be that conducive to human species. Using that understanding and argument, how much success have universities like St Andrews had on making a stronger case for mitigation activity? Or how much success do you think this argument may have given the risks are being accepted and understood in a much more serious capacity at senior level? So I'll unmute David first of all, and he can answer his perspective.
We're a 600-year-old institution, and within our mitigation, I've been looking at how can we survive another 600 years post-oil and post-gas, hence the big biomass plant and the Kenley wind farm that we're looking at for providing our electricity. However, the adaptation, if, for instance, sea level rises 1.5 meters, the fact that we may be flooding part of our site is going to be peanuts compared to the millions and billions of people who will be suffering around the world. But from our institution, there are some simple things that we can do. And all we're trying to do, we're not trying to solve climate change with our mitigation. We're not trying to have a perfect university for whatever the future is. It's more just thinking about things, taking care about not doing a dumb thing like building something in a floodplain that's going to just get flooded the year after it's built, or thinking about our transport links, or thinking about it's just thinking differently within the university. So if you take an apocalyptic view, heaven knows what the weather's going to be like in 50 years, let alone 600. There are some predictions, but things are, my sense is that things are changing very fast. Within the operation of the university and the league tables and Brexit, which is meaning our 20% funding gap for us. So I mean, all of our funding plans are now suddenly we're getting 20% less income, and we're finding that right away now. It's low beer, but it's something that at least we can be thinking about and doing at the moment. That's me.
Thank you, David. So that's all the questions we've got. So thank you again to Sophie and David for their input. I will email you all a link to the podcast of the webinar tomorrow, so you can refer to a later date and also share it with any relevant colleagues. The next part of our webinar series, Adaptation Part 2, Public Bodies Climate Change Reporting and Identifying Existing Adaptation Action, will take place next Wednesday, 20th of July at 12 noon. This session will also be led by Sophie from Adaptation Scotland, with input from Roddy Yar from the University of Strathclyde. The third webinar in the series will be at the same time on the following Wednesday, the 27th of July, and will be led by Penelope Pickering, a sustainability consultant at ACOM, and will look at how tertiary education organisations can integrate their findings from climate change risk assessments and adaptation assessments into normal business activities. You can sign up to both these sessions on the EAUC website now, or if you're unavailable, you can find a link to request to receive a podcast of the webinar on those pages. Please remember to complete the feedback survey when you receive it. Thank you very much again for joining us. Goodbye.